My fiancé's religious mother came to me, crying the night before the wedding. She said, "She has another man she loves. Please don't marry her." And then I heard footsteps behind the door, and the night before my wedding, I should have been asleep. Instead, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, rehearsing vows that already felt foreign on my tongue. Every line I read aloud sounded like someone else had written it. The words were perfect, too polished, too certain. I kept wondering why my hands wouldn't stop trembling even though I'd been waiting for this day for 2 years. It was close to midnight when the knock came. A soft, hesitant sound, one that didn't belong in a hallway full of drunk groomsmen and laughter. I opened the door expecting maybe Owen, my best man, coming to drop off something he'd forgotten. But it wasn't him. It was Isabel's mother, Mrs. Alden, standing under the fluorescent light, still dressed in her church gray cardigan and holding a rosary like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked as if she'd come from a funeral instead of a wedding rehearsal. Her eyes were swollen, her cheeks damp, and for a moment I thought something had happened to Isabel. I stepped back instinctively, letting her in. She didn't wait to be invited. She moved past me like she'd already made up her mind about what needed to be said. The air changed the second the door closed. There was a strange stillness, as if the room itself understood this wasn't a visit, it was a confession. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clutching the rosary so tightly the beads left impressions in her skin. I'd always known her as the quiet, composed type. A devout woman who never missed Sunday service, who once told me she'd prayed for years for Isabel to find a good man. Now she couldn't even look at me. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. She said I shouldn't go through with the wedding. At first, I thought she was being dramatic or maybe overwhelmed by the stress of the event. But then her words started to take shape, sharp and deliberate. She said her daughter loved another man. That sentence lingered in the air like smoke. She didn't say it like a rumor. She said it like something she'd carried too long, something that had been eating away at her conscience. I stood frozen, watching her tremble as she explained that Isabel had been seeing someone before we got engaged, a man named Calder. I remembered the name. He had been a distant friend from her hometown, someone who still sent her birthday messages and harmless inside jokes. Or so I had thought. Mrs. Alden said she had caught them together once before, last summer, when Isabel was visiting. She'd promised it was over, and her mother had chosen to believe her because the alternative was unbearable. But now, on the eve of the wedding, Mrs. Alden said she couldn't keep silent anymore. She said she'd rather live with the shame of her daughter's broken engagement than the guilt of watching me marry a lie. The room started to tilt. Everything she said sounded rehearsed but desperate, like she had repeated it to herself on the drive over. I wanted to tell her she must be mistaken, that she didn't know what she was saying. But she looked at me with a kind of broken certainty that left no space for denial. I leaned back against the dresser, trying to find the right words, but only managing to ask how she could possibly know this. She said Isabel had been acting strangely the last few weeks, sneaking out late, taking calls outside, hiding her phone like a teenager. She mentioned Calder again, that she overheard Isabel on the phone saying she wished things could be different, that she couldn't stop thinking about him. There was no anger in her voice, only sorrow. The kind that comes when faith starts to unravel. When she finished, she pressed her palms together and whispered that she had sinned by waiting so long to tell me. Then she stood, as if the act of speaking had drained everything she had left. I followed her to the door, unsure what to do. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't anything yet. My mind was moving too fast to settle on one emotion. As she stepped into the hall, I heard it, the faintest sound of movement from the other side of the corridor. Not footsteps at first, more like the shift of weight on carpet. Then a quick scuffle, soft but unmistakable, followed by the quiet click of a door closing at the far end. I froze. Mrs. Alden didn't seem to notice. She was too lost in her own storm. I walked into the hallway, scanning the dim stretch of light between the doors. Nothing moved, but I could still feel it. Someone had been standing there, watching, listening. The scent of Isabel's perfume, jasmine and something floral, hung faintly in the air. It wasn't possible, I told myself. She couldn't have been here. The bridal suite was on another floor. But that smell wasn't my imagination. When I turned back to Mrs. Alden, she was already heading toward the elevator, wiping her face. I let her go without another word. I didn't want to see her expression again. Back inside the room, everything looked the same but felt completely different. The vows on the desk, the tuxedo hanging by the mirror, the pair of gold bands glinting under the lamp. They were all part of a picture that no longer made sense. I sat down again and tried to replay the conversation, hoping I had misunderstood something. But every sentence aligned too cleanly with the doubts I'd been ignoring for weeks. The late-night texts, the sudden work calls, the way she'd gone quiet whenever I mentioned marriage. I glanced at the clock. It was 12:47 a.m. In less than 12 hours, I was supposed to stand in front of 200 people and promise to spend my life with someone whose mother had just told me she was in love with another man. Sleep wasn't an option. I poured myself a glass of water and sat in the dark, listening to the hotel's air conditioner hum in steady rhythm. Every few minutes, I thought I heard faint echoes of movement in the hallway again, but it might have been my imagination feeding on what-ifs. Still, I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside that door, listening, waiting. The perfume had been too distinct. When dawn began to bleed through the curtains, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Isabel immediately. Not yet. If what her mother said was true, she would reveal it herself soon enough. And if it wasn't, I needed proof before I destroyed something that couldn't be rebuilt. I dressed quietly, buttoning my shirt with a calmness I didn't feel. The ring box sat on the nightstand, small and heavy, like an anchor tied to a promise that no longer meant what it used to. Outside, the city was just waking up, but in my mind, something had already ended. The wedding hadn't even begun, and the silence between us had already started to rot. That night, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before, that sometimes truth doesn't arrive in shouting matches or dramatic revelations. Sometimes it comes quietly, wearing a familiar scent, standing just outside your door. And I knew then that tomorrow wouldn't unfold the way anyone expected. I didn't sleep. The morning sunlight cut through the blinds like thin blades, and all I could think about was that faint scent outside my door. The perfume, the shadow that vanished before I could see it. Every nerve in my body was on edge, but I forced myself to act normal. Weddings are built on performance, and I had to play my part until I knew the truth. Downstairs, the hotel lobby was already busy. The staff carried trays of breakfast, florists arranged bouquets, and photographers checked their gear. The place felt like a stage where everyone knew their lines except me. I smiled at whoever crossed my path, but inside I was dissecting every detail, every look, every whisper. Isabel's bridal suite was 2 floors up. I told myself I was only going to drop off a gift, something symbolic, something that would look innocent enough if anyone saw me there. My hands didn't shake when I wrote the card, but my stomach turned when I reached her door. It was slightly open. That small crack felt like an invitation and a warning at once. I pushed it just enough to look inside. The room was empty, though traces of her were everywhere. Makeup scattered across the counter, a white silk robe draped over the chair, half-drunk champagne on the dresser. And then I noticed it. By the window, next to a row of shoes, was a plain box, something that didn't belong among all the wedding decorations. It was a shoebox with a lid, slightly ajar. I didn't mean to look inside. My mind just pulled me toward it. Inside were cosmetics, a folded scarf, and something black tucked under the fabric. When I moved it aside, I found a second phone. It wasn't her regular one. I recognized her case, the golden one with the tiny cross charm hanging from it. This phone was different, cheap, scratched, and almost dead, but it was hers. I pressed the side button. The screen lit up, revealing a string of recent messages. The last one was from a contact named C. I didn't need to guess who that was. The message read, "One more night. Then it's over, I promise." The timestamp was 2 nights ago. Another message appeared above it. "I still can't believe you're going through with it." The pit in my stomach deepened. My fingers moved before I could think, scrolling up through weeks of messages that painted a story I didn't want to read. They'd met multiple times. The tone wasn't casual, it was intimate. He wasn't a stranger. He was the man her mother had begged me to protect myself from. For a moment, I stood there holding the phone, surrounded by everything meant to symbolize our future. Her wedding dress on the rack, the veil hanging like a ghost, the fragrance of flowers waiting to be carried down the aisle. The whole room felt staged for a ceremony that was already dead. A sound in the hallway pulled me back. Soft footsteps. I turned instinctively, shoving the phone into my jacket pocket. The door opened wider, and there was Owen, my best man. He froze when he saw me standing there. His face changed fast, from surprise to discomfort to something closer to guilt. He tried to act casual, asking if I'd come to drop off something for Isabel. I nodded. My voice came out calm, but my mind was dissecting his every movement. He wasn't looking at me directly. His eyes darted toward the shoe rack, then back to the door. He knew about the phone. Owen and I had been friends since college, and I'd never seen him this nervous around me. His shirt collar was uneven, his hands twitching slightly. I told him I'd already left the gift and walked past him. He didn't move out of my way immediately, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I brushed his shoulder as I left, and I could feel his pulse racing. The elevator ride down felt endless. I stared at my reflection in the metal doors, wondering if I'd already crossed some invisible line. If I had confronted her then, the entire day would have erupted into chaos. But I needed more than a hidden phone. I needed confirmation. Proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. I sat in the lobby with a cup of coffee I didn't drink. The guests began arriving, dressed in suits and pastel dresses. They greeted me with smiles, unaware that every one of them was about to witness something unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. I took out the phone again, dimming the brightness. There were missed calls from an unknown number, a few voicemails I didn't play, and several photos, some of Isabel, some of a man whose face was partially visible in a car mirror. That was enough. I saved one photo and one message onto my own phone, then slid the burner device back into my pocket. Around noon, I saw her for the first time that day. She walked into the reception area surrounded by bridesmaids, her face glowing under the soft light, the kind of glow that used to make me feel lucky. Now, it made me feel sick. She smiled when she saw me and reached out, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes, a flicker of fear that hadn't been there before. Maybe she knew. Maybe she had been the one outside my door last night, listening to her mother's confession. We barely spoke. The photographer arranged us for pictures, telling us to stand closer, to hold hands, to look happy. I followed instructions like a mannequin. She kept glancing toward the staircase as if expecting someone to appear. That's when I saw Calder for the first time in person. I didn't recognize him at first. He was with a group of guests I didn't know well, one of Isabel's distant cousins or old family friends, I guessed. Tall, dark hair, the kind of man who looked comfortable being admired. When his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of discomfort, quickly buried under a polite smile. He extended a handshake later, during the pre-ceremony mingling, and introduced himself casually, as if we hadn't just exchanged silent recognition of something rotten. It was him. I'd seen that same jawline reflected in the car mirror in one of the photos. I felt oddly calm. There was no rage, no trembling, just a sharp focus settling in my mind like frost forming on glass. I realized I didn't need to scream or accuse anyone. I just needed to show the truth. And for that, timing was everything. By the time we moved to the church, the sun had turned harsh, and the stained glass windows spilled red and gold light across the aisle. The guests took their seats, whispering softly while the organist rehearsed a hymn. Owen stood at my side, his nerves almost visible. I hadn't said a word to him since the morning, and that silence made him sweat. I could tell he wanted to warn me, or maybe beg me not to do what I was planning. But he didn't understand. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning honesty. Brutal, public, undeniable honesty. While the attendants arranged the microphones, I slipped the hidden phone from my pocket. My own phone buzzed once in my jacket, probably a message from Owen or the wedding planner, but I ignored it. I connected the device to the wireless speaker setup the sound tech had prepared earlier for background music. It synced almost instantly. When I heard Isabel's laughter echo faintly from the bridal room down the hall, something inside me hardened. I had loved that sound once. Now it felt hollow. In a few hours, when everyone stood to witness vows that meant nothing, they would hear the truth instead. I didn't know what would happen afterward, how people would react, how she would defend herself, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. By the end of the ceremony, there would be no more secrets left to hide behind. The church was already half full when I arrived. A soft murmur rolled through the pews as guests fanned themselves with folded programs, unaware that the most important moment of the day wasn't the wedding. It was what would come right before it. The stained glass windows threw colored light across the floor, and every beam seemed too bright, too artificial. I walked down the aisle with Owen at my side, both of us in matching suits. He tried to make conversation, but his words fell flat against my silence. I could feel him watching me, realizing that whatever I discovered this morning hadn't faded. It had sharpened. The officiant greeted me, asked if I was ready, and I nodded. My voice sounded steady. I had practiced this tone all morning. The calm of a man who already knows the outcome but waits to let the world catch up. When the music started, everyone rose. The doors opened, and Isabel appeared at the far end of the aisle, her arm linked through her father's. The sight of her should have felt like a dream. Instead, it felt like an ending disguised as a beginning. She moved gracefully, eyes downcast, every step rehearsed. When she finally looked up at me, I saw the faintest flicker of hesitation, the same guilt I'd caught earlier. The sunlight from the windows framed her like an image meant for worship, but the illusion didn't reach her eyes. She reached the altar. I took her hand, cold and trembling, and for a second I thought she might collapse right there. The priest began his introduction, speaking about love, loyalty, and faith. His words echoed through the vaulted ceiling, but to me they sounded hollow, like reading scripture in an empty cathedral. While he spoke, I glanced at Owen. He avoided my gaze. His expression was pale and tight, his lips pressed together in dread. He knew what was coming, or at least sensed it. I reached into my jacket, feeling the weight of the small black phone. My thumb brushed against the cracked screen. I'd already linked it to the speaker system earlier, testing it discreetly under the guise of checking the playlist. The connection was ready. All it needed was one action. The priest turned to me, asking if I had prepared my vows. I said yes. I took a slow breath, stepped closer to the microphone, and told everyone I wanted to start my vows differently. That love should be transparent, unafraid of truth. People smiled, thinking it was romantic. They had no idea. I opened the phone, navigated to the audio messages. My pulse didn't quicken. Everything inside me felt still, almost mechanical. I pressed play. At first, there was silence. Then, a man's voice came through the church speakers. Casual, intimate, unmistakably real. Calder's voice. He said her name, soft and familiar, followed by words that turned the entire room cold. He said he couldn't believe she was marrying someone else while still meeting him in secret. He told her he loved her, that she'd promised the wedding wouldn't happen. The sound echoed against the stone walls, carried through the air like a confession none of them were ready to hear. For a second, the crowd didn't move. Then a few heads turned toward Isabel. Her face drained of color. The priest stopped mid-sentence, staring at me in confusion. A low murmur rippled through the guests as the meaning sank in. Isabel reached for the microphone, but I stepped back. She tried to speak, her mouth opening without sound, then turned toward her mother, who was standing in the second row clutching her rosary. Mrs. Alden's eyes were closed, lips moving silently in prayer. Owen looked like he might faint. He whispered my name once, but I didn't answer. I simply turned the volume up slightly, so there was no mistaking what everyone was hearing. The recording continued for another few seconds before I stopped it. That was all it took. The church fell into complete silence. No one dared breathe. The only sound was the faint buzz of the speakers fading into static. I looked at her, and for the first time since last night, she met my eyes directly. There was no denial in them, only panic. She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, sliding the phone into my pocket. I didn't need to explain anything. The truth had already spoken for itself. Her father stood up, confusion painted across his face, but her mother was already trembling, trying to steady herself on the pew. The priest muttered something about taking a short pause, but no one moved. The wedding had ended without ever beginning. Isabel whispered something I couldn't hear, maybe an apology or an excuse, but the words didn't matter. She turned toward her mother, who shook her head and wept quietly. Calder wasn't there. I had made sure he received a late invitation, far too late to attend, but his absence only made it worse. It left her alone with the echo of his voice. I took one step back, then another, my shoes clicking against the floor in the heavy silence. People started to murmur again, a growing wave of disbelief spreading across the pews. Some guests turned to each other, others simply stared at the ground. As I reached the aisle, I heard someone call my name. Maybe Owen, maybe the officiant, but I kept walking. I passed Mrs. Alden, who couldn't even lift her head. I stopped beside her for a moment, rested a hand gently on her shoulder, and she looked up with tear-filled eyes. She didn't speak, but I saw it there, gratitude and shame intertwined. Outside, the sunlight hit me like heat after a long storm. The courtyard was empty except for the doves in their decorative cage near the entrance, meant to be released after the ceremony. They fluttered restlessly, unaware that the moment they were meant for would never come. I stood there for a few seconds, listening to the muffled chaos behind the church doors, people shouting, gasping, demanding explanations. Then I loosened my tie and walked away. By the time I reached the parking lot, my phone was already buzzing nonstop, calls from Owen, messages from guests, even one from her father. I ignored them all. I got in my car, started the engine, and just sat there with the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. For a moment, I expected to feel anger, grief, maybe even relief. Instead, I felt nothing. Just a strange clarity, like the world had reset itself. I looked at the empty seat beside me, the bouquet of flowers meant for her still lying there. I rolled down the window and let the wind take them piece by piece until only the stems remained. Then I drove. Not home, not anywhere in particular. Just away. Behind me, I imagined the scene unraveling, the guests leaving in confusion, her family falling apart in whispers, her reputation collapsing under the weight of one recording. It wasn't revenge. It was exposure. The truth, raw and final, standing on its own. When the church disappeared from my rearview mirror, I realized I'd never step foot there again. And for the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. I didn't go back to the hotel that night. I drove until the city disappeared behind me, past gas stations and billboards until the road became empty and quiet. When I finally stopped, it was at a rest area overlooking a lake. The air was cold, clean, and still. For the first time in weeks, I could hear my own thoughts without someone else's noise crowding them. My phone was still vibrating with messages, dozens of them. Missed calls from Owen, voicemails from her father, even one text from an unknown number that only said, "You didn't have to do that." I guessed it was Calder. I turned the phone off and left it face down on the dashboard. By the next morning, the story had already spread. Someone had recorded the moment in the church, the audio echoing through the speakers, Isabel's face crumbling, the crowd murmuring in disbelief. The clip started making rounds online among our social circles, then further. People always say gossip travels fast. I didn't realize how fast until I stopped for coffee and saw two strangers watching the video on their phones. They didn't recognize me. I stood behind them in line, listening to their commentary, their quiet shock. I felt detached from it, as if it were happening to someone else. That same morning, Owen finally reached me. His voice was tight, apologetic. He said the entire Alden family had broken down after I left. Isabel's father had shouted at her in front of everyone, demanding an explanation, while Mrs. Alden fainted before anyone could calm her. Calder, it turned out, had worked for the same company where Isabel's father was a senior partner. The fallout had been immediate. Her father called the office and had him suspended pending an internal investigation. Within a week, Calder lost his job entirely. Misconduct, reputation damage, conflict of interest. Owen asked me if I felt satisfied. I didn't answer. Satisfaction wasn't the word. It wasn't joy either. It was something colder, a finality that didn't need applause. I went home 2 days later to pick up my things. The apartment still smelled faintly of her perfume, but it was fading. The framed engagement photos were gone. I'd smashed them the morning before the rehearsal dinner, though I hadn't realized then why I'd felt so uneasy. Maybe some part of me had always known. There was a letter waiting for me by the door. No return address, just my name in delicate handwriting. I recognized Mrs. Alden's careful script immediately. Inside, the letter was short. She said she was ashamed, but grateful. She wrote that truth, no matter how brutal, had saved her daughter from a life built on lies, and that I had done what she couldn't. She said she had prayed every night since the wedding for forgiveness, not from God, but from me. I folded the letter and set it on the counter. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. The next few weeks passed like fog. My company granted me an extended leave, calling it personal recovery. I didn't argue. I spent my days driving to unfamiliar places, small towns, quiet diners, places where no one knew me. Every so often, I heard updates through Owen. Isabel had moved out of her parents' house and gone to live with a cousin 2 states away. Her father had disowned her publicly, cutting her off financially. The family name carried weight in their community, and the scandal burned through it like fire. Even the church stopped returning their calls after the priest's statement about sacred vows being treated as a mockery. It sounded cruel, but it wasn't my doing. The truth had a way of continuing on its own once released. One night, around 3 weeks after the wedding, I was sitting on a park bench overlooking the bay when a car pulled up behind me. For a second, I thought it might be Owen again, but it wasn't. It was Isabel. She looked different, paler, thinner, wearing no makeup. Her once perfect posture was gone. Her movements were hesitant, almost defensive. She said she'd been trying to find me for days. She wanted to explain, to make me understand that she hadn't meant for it to happen the way it did. I didn't interrupt her. I just listened. She said she had been confused, that Calder had been part of her life before me, that she thought she'd buried those feelings but hadn't. She said she still loved me, that what we had was real even if she'd been lost. Her voice cracked when she said that word, lost. It didn't sound like an excuse, more like a diagnosis. When she finished, she asked if I could ever forgive her. I told her that forgiveness wasn't something I was withholding. It was something that no longer applied. What had existed between us had already been erased, not by my anger, but by her own choices. You can't rebuild trust once it's burned down to ash. She started crying, but there was no scene, no shouting. She left quietly after realizing there was nothing left to fix. Watching her car disappear down the road, I felt a strange emptiness that wasn't sadness. It was relief that the story was finally closing. After that night, I didn't see her again. Months later, I heard from Owen that Calder had left the city completely. Someone said he tried to start fresh in another state, but word of what happened followed him. In an industry built on image, reputation is currency, and his was bankrupt. As for Mrs. Alden, she kept writing. Each letter came softer, less apologetic, more reflective. In one of them, she mentioned how the scandal had forced her to confront the very faith she'd built her life on. She wrote that sometimes honesty destroys what prayer tries to protect, and that perhaps both were necessary. I never wrote back, but I kept every letter. Eventually, I sold the ring and the honeymoon tickets, donated the refund from the venue to a local shelter. It wasn't charity. It just felt right to let something good come out of something ruined. When I finally returned to work, no one mentioned the wedding. My coworkers treated me with the careful politeness people reserve for those who've survived something public. But I could tell they'd seen the clip. Everyone had. A year later, I transferred to another branch in a quieter town by the coast. My new apartment overlooked the harbor, and in the evenings, I'd watch fishing boats return with their lights swaying on the water. Life became smaller, simpler. I no longer checked social media. The world felt better without constant noise. Sometimes, when the wind carried the faint scent of jasmine from the park below, I'd think of that night, the perfume outside my door, the sound of retreating footsteps. I realized then that what had seemed like betrayal from others had also been my own blindness. I had wanted the perfect life so badly that I ignored every crack forming underneath it. Now, I keep my life deliberately unadorned. I still believe in love, but I no longer chase the version of it that needs to look flawless in photographs. The kind worth having doesn't demand performance, it survives silence. People still ask if I'd ever marry again. I always answer the same way. Maybe, if the truth arrives first this time.